This is Let's Talk with Hart Hagen, and today I'm joined by Steve Bartlett. Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks, Hart.
Steve is the field organizer with the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. Steve and I have been friends for a while and have a lot of common interests, including an interest in Latin America, an interest in labor rights. So we're going to talk today about why we need local agriculture, why we need local food, local farming, local agriculture. Steve, how can we get this conversation started? It's like we're in the coronavirus. Let me just take a minute or two to set the stage. We're in coronavirus, and some of our supply chains are breaking down. So supply chains, meaning we have this thing called globalization, which is a really problematic term. We have things like NAFTA, we have things like the World Trade Organization, whereby we're supposed to be trading a lot with other countries, and that's supposed to be a good thing. Unfortunately, NAFTA and the World Trade Organization have been instruments to concentrate power and money into the hands of a very few at the expense of the very many. When NAFTA was negotiated back in the mid-90s by Clinton and his people, that then, what was I going to say? Labor wasn't at the table, and the environment wasn't at the table. So what NAFTA and the World Trade Organization do is give multinational corporations a way of trading at our expense. So they can get labor overseas, they can ship factories overseas, they can ship in foods. And one of the things that NAFTA and the World Trade Organization do is that they make it impossible or difficult for localities and states and national governments to make laws to protect the people. So NAFTA and the World Trade Organization are used to invalidate environmental laws, invalidate labor laws, and multinational corporations can sue governments, but governments can't sue corporations. It's a really messed up situation in which a lot of totalitarian power has been concentrated into a very few hands. So that's what I bring to this. And so let's talk about, so now fast forward to today, we're in the age of coronavirus. And that slows down our supply chains. Now we're seeing how it wasn't a good idea for us to depend on these multinational, international supply chains. Not that there shouldn't be any international trade, but that it needs to be sensible and rational and moderate, when what we've had is not sensible or rational or moderate. So, Steve, am I on the right track with that? And what does any of that have to do with local food and agriculture?
So there's an argument, I think a supported argument, that the industrialization of agriculture that took place, especially in the United States and in Europe, that led to huge surpluses of monocultures, that occurrence, which was to the benefit of large input corporations and retailers, and machinery makers, but weren't really to the benefit of family farmers who were pitted against each other and forced to compete.
So let's define a couple of terms. Let's define monocultures and let's define inputs.
Yeah, well, agriculture is an industry that requires a lot of inputs, a lot of assets up front, and a lot of credit is needed. So farmers were kind of squeezed between the idea of producing. They were following the rules put by the ag universities and the corporations that were pushing the agenda in these universities to so-called modernize agriculture. So the Green Revolution, was kind of the name we given to that movement to make farmers rely on supposedly become more modern and efficient. But in fact, what the efficiency was just measured in a distorted way by the yields of monocultures. Monoculture is when you grow one crop in a large area of land. And so wheat and rice and corn, which are hybridized and varieties of higher yielding, seeds were produced as part of the Green Revolution. And the claim was these were going to protect humanity from starvation. It was the old argument that the Malthusian argument that population increase was going to overrun our ability to feed ourselves. This was an ill thought out concept then, and it's an ill thought out concept now, even with a larger world population. All that meant was that larger producers using modern methods and relying on chemical fertilizers, large machinery, mechanization, pesticides, herbicides, that those would become the big players in the economy of agriculture. That
So
surplus,
why should the okay, go ahead.
that surplus pushed U.S. trade negotiators to create something like NAFTA and CAFTA and the World Trade Organization. The agricultural interests pushed our government to push for those trade agreements. Why? Because they had a surplus, and the price, it's a kind of internal contradiction of capitalism. You produce a large surplus of the product, you push down wages for farmers and farm workers. Therefore, the people who are doing the work cannot afford to buy the product. This caused internal contradiction of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So that product that was then, we had to find new markets for that product. And so the idea was to feed the world, quote unquote, feed the world. So NAFTA basically.
Archer Daniels Midland, supermarket to the world.
Yep, Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, et cetera, et cetera. These
Monsanto,
corporations then, they
John
got
Deere, International Harvester.
Right, just a few corporations, monopolizing trade, monopolizing seed production, making seeds convenient, quote unquote, convenient for farmers so they could use them on large scale production. So this led to, the dependency. We basically dumped our, in a lot of cases, low quality food, because modern hybrids were lower in protein. They were lower in all kinds of trace minerals, nutrients, but they were high yielding. So those are the kinds of crops that we began dumping on the global south predominantly. And
so if we're dumping, that means it's not free trade.
Well,
or if it is free trade, it's the type of free trade that favors the big players and tends to drive small farmers out of business and be bad for consumers and so forth.
It put family farmers out of work in the United States, and it put family farmers out of work across the global south. And of course, NAFTA, it started with Mexico, and millions of Mexican farmers were put out of business. They couldn't sell their corn anymore because we were dumping huge amounts of corn. Trailerfuls of 18-wheelers with shipping containers were headed across the border to Mexico. They set up 500 Walmart mega stores all over Mexico. They pushed our seeds and our hybridized seeds and our genetically modified seeds on the Mexican farmers in order to dispossess the small scale farmers so that they could more easily be consolidated and put out of business, and land could be consolidated.
It's terrible. There's all this rhetoric, the rhetoric like globalization, free trade, free market, competition. All of this is really, it's designed to protect and advance the interests of a very, very few.
So I want to give a couple examples, if you allow me to tell a couple stories. So as a result of this, an organization came into being worldwide called La Via Campesina, and it was an organization basically that came together to fight these trade agreements, to fight the introduction of and the imposition of genetically modified seeds and seed regimens that prevented farmers from collecting and sharing and reproducing their own seeds. And Via Campesina organized and educated the base of their organizations from across the world. About 71 countries across the world have organizations who are members of La Via Campesina. And among them were organizations in Haiti. There are 4 or 5 peasant organizations in Haiti that have been members of Via Campesina for many years and understood deeply what the threat of free trade was. Of course, Haiti was the first experiment in free trade with the United States. We had a Caribbean basin initiative that Reagan put into movement, and the first free trade agreements were signed with Haiti for rice exporting. and it was Bill Clinton who pushed it when he was the governor of Arkansas to have a free trade agreement with Haiti so that the large-scale rice producers in Arkansas could export their surplus rice to Haiti. And that happened, and about 180,000 Haitian families who used to be rice producers were dispossessed by that cheap, what they call it Miami, they call it Miami rice, and
Yeah.
they were dispossessed from the rice producing area of Haiti, and had to move to the capital city of Port-au-Prince when the earthquake hit and killed many of those former families of rice producers, died or suffered the terrible calamity of the earthquake in 2010.
Let's look at a long-term trend here. When I was in school, I was taught that it was actually a measure of progress that, well, in my grandfather's time, maybe every other person was a farmer. And then in the 20th century, now the number of people working farms has gone down to about 4% of the population, something like that. That was thought to be a measure of progress. But part of the untold story there is that when you make life unlivable for farmers and for farm workers, then they go to the cities and provide a source of cheap labor. The same started happening like in the 1600s, the 17th century with the enclosure of the commons in England. But you drive farmers and farm workers off of the farm and make them, concentrate them into cities where they can provide cheap labor. That's a part of the story that was never told in school. Plus, I've heard that like 2 million farmers, NAFTA drove 2 million Mexican farmers out of business. NAFTA and things like that have driven Haitian farmers out of business. So heavily subsidized American rice gets sold in Haiti. The Haitian farmers can't compete, so they go out of business and go to the city where they're making 15, 20 cents an hour for manufacturers. Am I on the right track with that?
Yeah, so the story I'm going to tell you is a story of resistance and successful fight back against the large corporations. So when the earthquake hit in 2010 in Haiti, in June of 2010, it was an unusual and unexpected event. It shook in a way that demolished that capital city, Port-au-Prince, and many of the buildings were not up superly well built in any case, but the ground shook in such a way that even well-built buildings collapsed. Somewhere about 250,000 people lost their lives. After the earthquake, so an interesting thing happened. Usually the Haitian rural areas are more impoverished than the city, right? For the very reasons I just outlined. The neglect and dispossession of small-scale farmers in Haiti, and then the free trade agreements that wiped out. USDA at one point even forced Haitians to kill all their pigs because there was a swine fever.
Oh, yeah.
And so there were many interventions that the U.S. made in Haiti that destroyed small-scale farming. So as a result, the earthquake, Port-au-Prince is a huge city, very densely populated, but the earthquake destroyed the capital. And about 800,000 survivors of the earthquake could not find no food in the capital, and they found any way they could to get back to their home villages and their hometowns where they still had family, or in some cases just any countryside they could get to. And so the farmers had to feed about 800,000 refugees from the earthquake. And as a result, many of the farmers used their seed corn and their seed rice and their seed peanuts to feed the direct needs of the refugees from the earthquake. Now, at that very moment, Monsanto, who didn't have any kind of foothold in the markets in Haiti, Monsanto decided they were going to give 400 tons, they said, of seed for Haitians to use to plant their new crops. Of course, and they said, it's a gift. We're just going to give it to you. UPS offered free transportation of these seeds down to Haiti. And suddenly the first seeds came on the came down to Haiti to be given out, distributed to the farmers. Now, the Via Campesina organizations, the Movimiento Papai, the Tête Collée, a bunch of different peasant organizations, they knew right away that this was a direct threat to their future as small-scale farmers. That if these seeds were going to replace the traditional heirloom seeds that they were using, that this would be a disaster for Haiti. So they organized, and within 3 weeks, they organized a huge march out in the provinces in Papai, Central Province, Central Plateau, to denounce the Monsanto so-called offer of a gift, and they called it seeds of death, you know, and they actually paid the gasoline for the newspaper and the television crews to come from Port-au-Prince to cover this event. And they came out, and 30,000 peasants marched, and then they burned a big sack of these seeds. It was easy to identify Monsanto seeds because they were covered with a pink fungicide. And there's another example of how a corporation has no sensitivity of who they're providing seeds to. You don't give fungicide covered seeds to people who don't have gloves, who work with their hands, who don't plant with machines, who plant by hand, you know. But those seeds were all covered with a fungicide, and they were easy to identify. So they were burned at that event, and it resonated with the Haitian people. They understood that what Monsanto was doing was trying to put their foot on their neck, even worse than it already was, you know. So these seeds were rejected. The first 60 tons came into the country, and hardly any of them were planted because of this action that the peasant movement did, and the light that they shone on this. So as a result, luckily, the peasants also had allies among civil society and among relationships with other organizations outside of Haiti. So resources were channeled through the organization I was working for and through other organizations in order for Haitians to buy seeds that were there in Haiti. They were just in storage, but had to be purchased. So beans, rice, peanuts, corn, all those seeds were there in storage in Haiti, but people didn't have the money to buy them.
Let's talk about why why the heirloom seeds are better than Monsanto seeds.
Well, for one thing, they're adapted to the environment. They've been produced and saved. And when you produce a seed in a certain ecosystem and save those seeds are well adapted. Those are the healthy survivors of they're proven, right? You know that you're going to plant them again, they're going to do well. They're adapted to the local insects, they're adapted to the local soil conditions, the weather conditions. So, and they're not hybrids, so they can be reproduced and saved. Farmers need to be able to save their own seed. If not, then they're dependent on an external purchase of seed. And if you have a bad year, you don't have enough cash, you can't buy seeds. But you can save seeds from one season to the next. And that's the way humanity has been doing agriculture for 10,000 years, right? Mm-hmm. So we can't allow that to be taken away. Farmers should be the ones saving their own seed and sharing their seeds with others. You don't have to save every variety, but your neighbors are saving another kind of seed that you can swap, you can trade for, you can barter for. So as long as when I'm a farmer in the Dominican Republic, which is where I learned, and if I need plantain rootstock, then I go to a big farmer, a neighborhood farmer that has a big field of plantains, and then I trade maybe something that I have, and then they provide me the suckers, the plantain suckers to plant in my field.
So
that's the way farmers have always operated from time immemorial. Right?
Yeah, and the United States government, with our tax dollars, has used military and economic force to prevent farmers from farming in the way that they want to. You know, we're supposed to be the land of freedom. We're supposed to be a land where one of our key ethics is the right to be let alone, and we don't allow the farmers in other countries just to be left alone and left to do agriculture the way they see fit.
Exactly, but you know, the Haitians, very well organized. The first thing they do when they organize an agricultural community is put up a seed nursery, because they know that deforestation has been one of the terrible afflictions that has happened in Haiti because of the extreme conditions, the extreme oppression. and the extreme economic marginalization of farmers. So they set up a seed nursery for trees, and for fruit trees, and for shade trees, and for fuel trees for cooking the food, right? And that's how they start their agricultural um, recovery of lands. And all over many parts of Haiti, you have very, very productive areas. Haiti as a whole has problems, but many of the farmers have reforested, have put up beautiful agricultural systems into place with irrigation systems, et cetera, et cetera. So there are really pockets of paradise right within Haiti that still go on to this very day. And people eat very well in those places. They eat a healthy, balanced diet, right? So, people say, "Oh, it's a basket case." No, Haiti has survived so much, and they're still supporting a large population in fairly healthy conditions because most Haitians are still in the countryside, tied to their land, eating fresh fruits, eating fresh greens, and all those foods that they're
And people like that are living the way they want to live, they're a threat to the establishment. So the establishment pulls out all the stops militarily and economically to deprive them of their way of life because that's the threat of a good example.
Well, interestingly, it was a coalition of urban and rural uh, movements and organizations that were able to bring the first Aristide into power, the first really democratically elected president after the dictatorships that took place that were propped up by the United States government.
So you had Aristide, who was a popularly elected president. He was kind of a surprise that he got 70% of the vote. Prior to that, there was Papadoc Duvalier, who was a dictator, and somehow the people organized and voted Aristide into power. And then later, the United States put him out of power temporarily because he was the wrong guy. It's like you can have democracy as long as you elect who we want you to elect.
Yeah, the dictatorships fell, and then there were a series of military governments, and then finally they organized elections, and Aristide came to power. Unfortunately, he was knocked out with a coup. He was put into exile, and then he had to make a real terrible deal with Clinton in order for Clinton to help him come back into the country, and he became the president again. But he was now a neoliberal puppet president, basically of the United States. But the thing is, Haitians haven't given up yet. Even today, the struggle continues. And they are the example of the first, basically, revolution against colonialism that was successful in the Americas. When the Haitians got their freedom from the French in 1803 and declared their own Black Republic in 1804, that was a huge historical shift.
So Haiti was the first country of free men, the first country in the world of all free men. We like to think the United States was, but the United States, you had to be white, you had to be a property owner. But
to vote, yeah.
Haiti was the first country of all free men and the only successful slave revolt ever. And they have never finished catching hell from us and from France because they had the nerve to be free. Plus, they had to pay reparations to France for the longest time. And you had slave owners like Washington and Jefferson here in the US pulling out all the stops to oppress them because they didn't want the slave revolt in Haiti to spread to the United States.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Some of the slave revolts that took place down in Louisiana that are not often taught in history, hardly ever in mainstream history books, but which were very significant slave results that almost succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these large slave results that took place in the South were inspired, if not actually led, by Haitian slaves who had been brought to the United States after the freedom of Haiti, after the Haitian liberation. So there's a lot of interesting history that goes back. The other thing to note is that because France was deprived of their #1 colony at that time, the income from Haiti was the biggest source of income for France. And because of their military expeditions and Napoleon and everything, they were bankrupted when they lost Haiti. And so they had to sell the French territory to the United States. And so the Louisiana Purchase was due to the Haitian Revolution as well, because that led France to have to sell their territory in North America to the United States. It's interesting. So related to this, I think, is what's happening now in Venezuela. And I'd like to just touch on that. You know, the United States is trying to overturn a truly sovereign government in Venezuela. And right now, food sovereignty and the ability of the Venezuelans to produce their own food is a key element in them defending their government right now. And so, you know, you're seeing right now a strong return to local agriculture in Venezuela, and which had been neglected under the regime where the oil was the main source of their economy, and the government only paid attention to oil, and the oligarchy rose up based on the ill-gotten gains, the exploitative, you know, profiteering of those who were connected to the oil industry in Venezuela. But that has changed, and right now you have a crisis, multiple crises. You have the United States trying to overturn the Venezuelan government. You have these fake president declare himself president and all this stuff. You have a naval blockade now that Trump has put into place under the pretext of fighting so-called drug trafficking, which it's a joke, because everyone knows Venezuela is not a very serious cross point for cocaine. Colombia, our ally, is. That's where most of the cocaine comes from. But we're sent this blockade so-called to stop drug trafficking from crossing Venezuela, which is absurd. But we know the true reason is to try to increase the pressure and the military pressure on Venezuela, and we think that they're also trying to pay off paramilitaries in Colombia to come and try to fight, to undermine the Venezuelan government. Some of the partners that our alliance, the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, is working with in Venezuela are producing food and getting them to those in most need in the cities, those who don't have enough income to purchase food on the open market in Venezuela, which is controlled by oligarchs who are big importers of food and retailers of food. So,
so it's in the interest of the oligarchs to be able to use agricultural land to grow crops for export, and then to import, you know, not only food but other retail items for. And that's the story. It's the story of Latin America, and it's the story of the free world, of the third world, that they're not allowed to develop as an independent, industrialized economy. Mm-hmm. They are supposed to be there for exploitation. We're supposed to, they're supposed to open up their markets to us, open up their agricultural land to us, open up drilling and mining to us and to their oligarchs. But it's not, it's one of those things that trade is just a way of obscuring theft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, under Hugo Chavez and when he came to power in 1998, and then led this whole transformation of the Venezuelan economy to where the profits from oil were then used for the benefit of the majority, with massive social programs of uplift, and they cut poverty but dramatically. They brought literacy to the country. They brought healthcare. Thousands of Cuban doctors came in exchange for oil. Cubans sent their medical experts, doctors and nurses and medical healthcare workers. You know, here's an example. Here we're in the middle of a coronavirus, right?
Oh yeah.
Venezuela has they've contained the coronavirus. They have only about 100 and something cases, and they have very
7 deaths, something like that.
Yeah, and because they had help from the Cuban medical personnel that were in Venezuela, they are experts in this. They've been through Ebola. They were on the front lines in Africa with Ebola. They know what contagion is, and they said, look, you've got to control this. And so they helped warn the government, and the government then imported all this protective equipment and testing kits from China. Okay.
Doesn't
They,
the U.S. have the best healthcare system in the world?
so I don't think anyone is under that illusion anymore. We're number one in the world for coronavirus cases and for deaths by far. You
So
know,
there's a lot of Cuban doctors that have gone all over the world, not least of all Venezuela, Brazil, and places, and they have helped their healthcare system. As a result of that, Cuba and Venezuela, it's like it was a couple weeks back, but I saw a webinar that indicated that at the time anyway, Venezuela only had about 107, a little over 100 cases and only 7 deaths. And no doubt it's more since then, but it's just this is a population of 30 million people. So on a per capita basis, they're doing 10 times or 100 times better than we are.
I'm sent on a daily basis videos of the farmers in Venezuela who are producing and delivering food to the cities, and they're wearing masks and they're wearing gloves. They've adapted. The whole country has adapted to the coronavirus. Their economy, they know they need food, you know, so they are supporting these farmers, and it's a huge. To be honest, I almost would rather be in Venezuela right now personally than here, because here the threat of the coronavirus is much greater. We don't have testing yet. They have testing. They're doing contact tracing of everyone who's been exposed to anyone who had a case there in Venezuela. In one recent
But they're
news,
socialists. What do they know about organizing an economy or a society?
well, I think we can see now that socialism and some strong sense of, let's say, people-oriented central planning
People
can be
over profits, yeah.
can be very important in a time like this. So, uh, you know, they found that they had that complete compliance because they were already well organized across the country to resist a potential invasion by the United States. And so they are well prepared, and coronavirus is just another thing that they were well well prepared and organized to deal with, right? Despite the fact that they have lost, their economy has shrunk by 70% because of the drop of oil prices and because of the sanctions and blockade that the U.S. is imposing against Venezuela and the theft of their assets abroad. It's really a criminal thing that's
It
this
is.
blockade against Venezuela. And despite all that, they've controlled the coronavirus. You know, it's an amazing
Right.
achievement. It's an amazing
It is.
achievement. Yeah.
Well, when I see, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo say, they just stand at the microphone and they lie and they lie and they lie about the true nature of Venezuelan economy, the true nature of the leaders of Venezuela, the true nature of American impact and influence on Venezuela. And I tell you, Pompeo gets on my last nerve. He is just a straight up gangster who wants to steal what the Venezuelan people have. Plus, if you look at elections, they have a great deal more election integrity than we do. I mean, Chavez and Maduro have been elected have been elected fair and square in free elections time after time after time. Meanwhile, back in the United States, there is no end to the voter suppression. There is no end to rigged elections. We have these proprietary computer systems that obscure the true vote. Mm-hmm. And we are the ones that have a problem with elections and democracy, not Venezuela.
I just saw videos of Venezuelan who had left the country, who are coming back on foot through Colombia, and they are greeted at the border. They are greeted very warmly. They all have their IDs, and they're identified by their thumbprints because they had to do that for their election ID. They're tested for coronavirus on the spot when they arrive. The test results come in within an hour or two. Then they're put on a bus and sent on their way, having been registered, welcome back into the country. And if they have coronavirus, they're going to go into quarantine. And all their contacts are going to be traced. You know, that's what the country is enabled to do, even in the midst of extreme economic hardship. in
Yeah.
Venezuela. Yeah. So they,
What
yeah,
what could we what else? I have a couple of questions. One is what can we learn from them, and two, what other stories do you want to tell about? I'm interested in some of the details of how agriculture works in places that you've seen. How you would like to see some of that imitated or replicated here in Louisville.
well, I think hardship. I think I think the hardship we're going through right now with the coronavirus is going to point us in the right direction, because I think people are realizing when food cannot reach you, or there's some, and maybe we haven't seen the end of this. There's going to be more and more food shocks in the coming months. I think people are realizing. I right away when the coronavirus hit, I'm like, thank goodness I have some dried corn, I have some dried beans, and I have a garden nearby with vegetables. I feel like I feel a lot less vulnerable to what might happen in the supermarkets and in the supply chain of food coming to me. I think in global warming is another big threat that we're all facing. It's a slower moving threat than the coronavirus, but it's coming down. It's breathing down on our necks right now. I mean, we've had people die of these extreme tornado events down the south this spring. Hurricanes are going to come. If you add a coronavirus to a hurricane, right, you're going to see major breakdown of social safety net and infrastructure and supply chains. So, I mean, I feel like we need to get more land as soon as possible and start putting it into production in local areas so that we can supply enough food for our own communities. I think that's the future of survival on the planet Earth, because we're not, even if we are able to turn back climate change, we're not going to be able to stop the effects for the next 10, 20, or 30 years of climate change that has already accumulated in the environment. We're going to need to have our ability to feed ourselves closer to home with everything that's coming down.
What does a resilient food and agriculture system in Louisville look like? What will we add to it? What will we do that we're not doing now?
I think it means the metro government of Louisville needs to prioritize making land that's vacant in the city accessible, making water cheap. I think they need to subsidize water use for local agriculture. I think they need to provide easy to get land leases to make vacant land green space and productive agricultural space, orchards. We need to have codes that allow for, I mean, private property needs to be rethought here. We need to think about how land can be used for the benefit of all, not just for private individuals. I mean, I think everything has to come back into question in facing these crises like pandemic, like climate change.
And zoning can be zoning law can be a tool for that. There's so many ways in which the WTO and NAFTA and even the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitutions tend to favor out-of-town corporations and absentee investors, but zoning can be a partial solution to that. But yeah, I like thinking in terms of the job of government, not least of all local government, is to protect the people and advance our interests. And if local government is in the business of advancing the interests of the very few, very rich, many of them absentees, then they're not doing their job or anything close to it.
I think the coronavirus has a very interesting side effect, and that is to show, first of all, how broken our system is, and second of all, to show how important it is to attend to the needs and infrastructure and support and health of every member of society, because as we're only as strong as the weakest community in the face of a pandemic, right? Right now we have farm workers who are not able to practice social distancing. They're living on crowded barracks in rural farms. We have meatpacking workers who are forced to work in unsafe proximity to each other in the middle of a pandemic in meatpacking houses all through the Midwest. These workers are among the most vulnerable. They are immigrants. Some of them are undocumented. the farm workers are coming from Mexico or Central America to work seasonally for Kentucky farmers, for North Carolina farmers, for Ohio farmers, for Tennessee farmers. Our agricultural system cannot survive now without them. We need their labor, and yet they are being forced to become the victims of exposure to a pandemic, while everyone else has the luxury of being paid a monthly unemployment wage and told to stay home and safe, right? But we have essential workers, healthcare workers are striking across the United States because they don't have enough protective equipment. This is really showing the real underbelly of exploitation of our economy. How workers in Sioux Falls at the Smithfield factory, they had to shut that factory down because almost everyone was sick with coronavirus, and there were so many people dying in Sioux Falls. Half of this whole state of North Carolina were meatpacking workers in the Smithfield packing house in Sioux Falls.
Dakota?
North Dakota, yeah. I mean, so the coronavirus can't be controlled unless we provide justice and correct, safe working place for the most vulnerable workers in our economy.
Yeah,
That's what it's showing us.
We've been taught cynicism. We've been taught individualism. We've been taught I got that our system is a meritocracy, and I got mine. And if you didn't get yours, it's because you didn't work hard enough. You didn't get an education. But the one real group of people that have been lied to and all that is the middle class. For what for what it's such as it is. I mean, the middle class and even the professional class have been taught that their interests are tied to the very rich, instead of seeing a different vision for society where we could see that the middle class and the upper middle class could have a lot more of what counts if we would see our interests as being tied to all people. And we could have a society that is much more pleasant, much more healthy, where we have much more free time if we stop the theft and the exploitation of the poor, the middle class, the professional class by the very, very rich. Am I blowing smoke? Am I on the right track with that?
I think the whole concept of a so-called middle class was a distraction from the fact that most people in the middle class still do not control the means of production. Okay, we're really the working class. We're part of the working class.
Yeah.
But the illusion that we might aspire to becoming wealthy, part of the aristocracy or the upper echelons of the economy, makes us identify with the wealthy rather than identify with workers, because who are the producers of wealth, right? According to Marx, wealth is produced by work, by the workers. Right. So most middle class people really should consider themselves to be from the working class, not from the middle class.
Yeah, and the minds of the workers are not being fully utilized. You have people that on average are just as intelligent as those at the very top, and yet we have all of this specialization, because if you're in a hierarchical work organization and your only purpose is to make money for those at the very top, then it tends to disenfranchise people instead of giving them a sense of ownership over what they do. Whereas if you had a democratically organized workplace, then everybody would tend to be included in the decision making. You have two roles. You're a worker in your specialized position, but you're also on the board of directors, so that you collectively as a workforce get to determine the major policy decisions of the organization. That is a circumstance in which people's minds would be engaged instead of this process of de-skilling, where you have, Adam Smith said, if somebody does the same thing day after day after day, then they're going to be as stupid and ignorant as a human being can be, which is not to call people stupid and ignorant, but it's just to say Adam Smith saw the hazards of de-skilling. And with these hierarchical work organizations, it's a formula for de-skilling, because the people that collect the profit only want to use you long enough to get you to do your work. And they don't care about your long-term development. They have an interest in putting you into a slot and having you do narrow work. And that's just all I'm saying, is that is not a circumstance in which people's minds and creativity and insights are utilized.
Yes, well, the word alienation comes to mind. That's what the Marxist theorist and Gramsci called alienation, right? And I don't know that it makes us stupid, but it makes us exploited and unhappy, right?
Yeah.
To
And
be in that situation.
it erodes our skills. And, you have people's minds just not being used because you're supposed to show up, you're supposed to do your work, your input is not wanted or needed. In fact, you're discouraged from giving input because if you say what people don't want to hear, then, well, you could get fired or you could be denied a promotion, that kind of thing.
I don't know if we have a lot of time, but
Okay.
one of the theories of about technology is that the simpler the tool, the greater the skill. So some take a tool like an axe, for example, instead of a chainsaw, right?
Mhm.
An axe, you need a lot more skill to use an axe the way an axe can be used. And I've seen an axe used in a way that astonished me. It was like almost like Michelangelo, right?
Huh.
um, people who use basic tools and use them, grow up using them, have great skill and knowledge of how to use. But when you add layers of technology on top, it actually simplifies and makes the task simpler and requiring less knowledge.
So you're
You
saying the
might not have
simpler the tool, the more skill you have to bring to bear
right,
on that. And then
exactly.
conversely, when you have tools that are expensive and sophisticated, then it's simpler to operate. But in agriculture, you have. We should really talk about the impact, the negative impact of machinery and pesticides and fertilizers, because we have an agricultural system now that's thought to be efficient and productive, both of which are highly questionable. And we have replaced human labor, human ingenuity, human insight with mechanization. And as a result, you have these huge monocultures that get farmed with heavy equipment, with pesticides that are neurotoxins. You have fertilizers that are heavily that take a lot of petroleum to produce, and it's we need a lot more farm laborers and a lot less mechanization. We need people to bring their skill so that we don't have to, create, because the agriculture that
Mm-hmm.
we have now is at war with pollinators. The
Mm-hmm.
agriculture that we have now is at war with wildlife. Nature is inherently diverse. Mono, uh, Industrialized agriculture is inherently monolithic. So whatever, if you have corn as far as the eye can see, then that crowds out nature. There's no room for nature in a monoculture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, our community garden, which is a tiny little garden, but it has when we have the children go around as in little groups and teams to compete to try to find how many species of plants and critters they can find in that little area, which is about 20 beds and some perennial fruit trees and berries. They find about 70 kinds of uh, plant species and more than 20 kinds of critters in that little area. And and that area, it's constantly changing and it's constantly feeding quite a lot of people.
So you're saying a community garden is a place where natural things can live and can coexist.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you got your name the different crops that you have, your beans and your lettuce, and if you got each one of those from a different place, it would come from a big monocrop field that is going to have a lot of erosion. It's going to not be a place where birds and butterflies and bees can live or thrive, let alone snakes or frogs or turtles or
Mm-hmm.
possums, raccoons, foxes. There's none of that wildlife can live in a big monocrop field.
Right. Yeah. And monocultures are the enemy of sustainability and ecology, basically,
Mhm.
because diversity is the birthright. It's the way Mother Nature builds strength and resilience in all of our ecosystems. through diversity.
So one aspect of that biodiversity is the biodiversity within a seed bank, or the, where you have, instead of, cloned seeds that Monsanto wants to sell you, you have you have seeds that have genetic diversity within them, or at least even if they're somewhat, what am I trying to say? They're cultivated, they've been subjected to propagation and horticulture, at least they're adapted to the local conditions. So I'm just saying that there's a type of agriculture where you have more biodiversity in it, right? Including the biological diversity. Like, talk about corn. I saw you do a video about corn. Talk about, just talk about corn.
So yeah, well, we have been growing corn for about 23 years now, and saving the seed every year, and basically using 2 heirloom open pollinated varieties of corn that pollinate themselves. And they've been through 2 droughts where all the neighbors' corns, the monocultures of the neighbors, all died. They perished in these droughts. But our corn, because of its characteristics, the deep roots, the big, thick, tall stem, which puts down a very deep taproot, survived. And we didn't get a big yield those years, but we got a yield. So basically, the corn that was produced in that drought condition are drought resistant, right? So the corn, because it's had to adapt to many different kinds of conditions and keeps renewing itself genetically by cross-pollinating among the variety of corns that we're planting, is very resistant. And it has in it a lot of capabilities, diverse capabilities to survive under different conditions. That's very different from a hybridized corn that's engineered just for a high yield. Our corn has more protein than hybrid proteins, hybrid corns, etc. So yeah, I mean, and then we grow our corn as an intercrop with beans and with squash. So it's not a monoculture at all. We grow it, even when we grow it, for our own nourishment, for our own food, our own staple food. We're growing it together with beans and squash, and those are 3 sisters that live together in harmony. So yeah, the diversity. I think, yeah, corn has a bad name because it's been subjected to such extreme genetic changes and monocultures. But our corn is beautiful. It's every color of the rainbow.
Didn't you say that in Mexico and Central America there are like 2,000 varieties of corn?
Oh, there are thousands of varieties.
Thousands.
Yeah. Yeah. And there were some of them were grown right here in the Ohio Valley, and we've recovered them, and we're their guardians, basically. The Bloody Butcher, the Hickory King, and there are other varieties. A friend recently just sent me another 4 kinds of varieties. We're going to try them out in different plots to see what kinds of characteristics they have. It's the way we interact with nature. It's
Right.
sort of like how you paint, how Michelangelo, it's his paints, how he uses to make the beautiful tapestry of his art. I mean, that's what Mother Nature has for us.
Yeah, we've got about, I don't know, 7 to 10 minutes left. I wanted to bring in a couple of Wendell-Berry concepts. One of them, and I'll be darned if I didn't, let me see, I'm going to pause just for a minute. So Wendell-Berry talks about how farmers will sometimes say, I'm just a farmer, with the idea that that's somehow a lower profession, a lower occupation. But farming, when it's done well and done right and done sustainably, it requires an ever accumulating body of knowledge and skill set. And so I wanted to say that, and you wanted to talk about how biological diversity, a biodiverse type of farming, is relevant to like the spread of diseases and stuff like that. So what is it, Steve, that we should be aware of in today's world about why should we want sustainable agriculture, sustainable biodiverse agriculture, as opposed to this agribusiness type of monoculture system that we have now that makes heavy use of pesticides and fertilizers and machinery?
So there's a growing body of research evidence that the pandemics that have been arising in the recent years have come in environments that have been disrupted. The ecologies have been disrupted. So where you have a harm to an ecosystem, a natural ecosystem, so the creatures of those ecosystems suddenly become in contact with humans who they didn't have contact with, or with other animals that humans are raising. So a lot of the pandemics, a lot of the diseases that have occurred and killed a lot of people in the recent years have come because of the artificial disruption of ecosystems by human, basically penetration into wild places, into wild ecosystems, by to do agriculture, to do monoculture type agriculture and animal husbandry in those environments. So a lot of the pandemics have come in industrial pig factories. There's evidence that this coronavirus came not directly from a bat being eaten in a soup in a market, but that there were people raising animals in a disturbed ecosystem where bats were suddenly in contact with these monoculture animal husbandry raising. There's evidence that it might have come through animals that people were raising in China that were themselves in contact with the bats that brought this vector into the animals. So there's a hazard to penetrating, to disturbing the what's called the agricultural frontier, the border between agriculture and more wild ecosystems. There's a danger of imposing monocultures in that environment, because that's where you have the interface of potential disease vectors with agricultural monocultures or animals that are being raised in that environment. Chicken, swine, chicken flu that came, these fevers and flus and different pandemic vectors have come when wild animals and their natural diseases have spread to industrial agriculture type operations. And so I think there's going to finally, when people really look through where the coronavirus come from, they're going to discover that it came in that way. And I think the SARS, the chicken fevers, the swine fevers, et cetera, have all come in that interface between wild nature and industrial style, monoculture style agriculture. So I think probably for the future, we need to consider that, because these pandemics are going to keep coming in that way.
Right. So when I think of sustainable agriculture, and when I think of the type of agriculture we need, when I think of the type of natural ecosystems that we need, they're much more localized than what we have now. I mean, ecosystems operate locally. So if we are concerned about the presence or absence of this or that bird or butterfly or bee, that we shouldn't just be looking at whether it's extinct globally. We should be looking at whether it's extinct locally. And when you have that thriving, biodiverse local ecosystem, that's a good thing for pest control, for one thing. And that is compatible with a local, biodiverse type of agriculture, rather than taking everything and turning it into a monocrop. Am I on the right track with that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's also easier to farm if you're more or less in harmony with the natural processes of any given area, for soil nutrient fertility cycles, mm-hmm. and for the insect pressures and pest pressures that can happen if you've disturbed the balance, the pest balance, the insect balance of the ecosystem, right? So all those things are impactful, and the more you can be in harmony with the natural systems, the more harmonious your production will be, the healthier your plants will be, and therefore the less impact of disease or predation or pest pressures on your plants, right? Soil fertility, but if you keep dumping chemical fertilizer as a substitute for real natural soil fertility, it's going to get out of whack, and the plants are going to become weakened, and then they're going to need pest protection, and then et cetera, et cetera. There's the regenerative agroecological forms of practices take advantage of the natural health of an ecosystem,
Right.
produce your food, right? Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, the type of farming we have today pays no attention to how healthy is the soil going to be in 20 years. It's all pressure to, take the land and turn it into a profit now instead of, we need a system where people can make a living on 1 or 200 acres, so that
Right.
you can know the land. And it's like you're saying, know what's peculiar to that particular land in terms of the slope, the type of soil, the amount of moisture that you have, the surrounding, the pest pressures, et cetera. We need people to be incentivized to have fence rows that have native plants and trees, so that you can have, a healthy supply of beneficial insects, which is 99% of them in my view. But we have a system where if you kill the prey, you kill the predator. If you kill whatever it is you consider a pest, if you kill off the pest, then you kill off whatever birds or wasps or other predatory insects might otherwise thrive on that pest.
Right.
Where, if you let the pest grow for a little while, then predators will come in and control that population, instead of, drenching everything in neurotoxin pesticides,
Right. It's
And in
like
the meantime, you're drenching our food in your damn neurotoxin pesticides.
yeah, the analogy works for health too, because we have antibiotics, but that's like using a broad spectrum pesticide, right? It kills the beneficial flora in your gut, and then
Right.
other problems come. Then you become
Right.
weakened, and your immune system becomes weakened. In the same way, we need to have good gut flora, and if you eat, you need to have a. We're not like isolated. We're not islands. We live with the flora and the microbial ecosystem that we're surrounded by. So the healthier your local biosphere is, the healthier your gut bacteria will
Well,
be.
this is fascinating. We're running out of time. We should come back and talk about this soon. Steve, thanks so much for joining me. And let's talk again soon about biodiverse agriculture and how that fits into a world that is sustainable and just for everybody. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Hart.
Okay, have a good day.
You too, man. Bye.